After receiving an urgent phone call, Brian wrapped up his workday and departed the mechanic shop where he spent countless hours under the hoods of cars and engines. His body was sore from the day's exertions, but his spirit remained unyieldingly strong. If you are not subscribed, I recommend you subscribe and activate the bell so you don't miss any videos. He was a man of average height, his physique honed and solid from the relentless physical demands of his job. His dark hair, trimmed short to endure the relentless sun, framed a face with eyes so dark they appeared almost black, radiating an intensity that spoke of both insatiable curiosity and indomitable resilience. Strolling through the quiet streets of his unassuming neighborhood, Brian's thoughts were abruptly interrupted by the pungent scent of smoke. A panicked voice echoed from up ahead. Brian's instincts kicked in without a moment's pause, propelling him toward the source of the alarm. The scene that met him was a heart-wrenching spectacle of chaos and destruction. A small house, squeezed tightly among others on the narrow street, was being devoured by a ferocious blaze. The flames licked hungrily at the walls, turning them into an inferno. Windows shattered under the intense heat, scattering lethal shards of glass in every direction. Firefighters fought valiantly against the raging fire, their efforts seeming futile as the water they sprayed turned to steam before it could quench the flames. Desperation and fear painted the faces of the gathered crowd. "There's a child inside," a woman cried out, her voice trembling as she clutched a firefighter's arm, pleading desperately, "Please, she's on the second floor." The firefighters, exhausted and smeared with soot, shook their heads solemnly. "It's too dangerous, Ma, I am. The building could collapse any second." Brian heard their words, but his heart refused to accept them. He couldn't stand by and do nothing while a child's life hung in the balance. Without hesitation or a word of explanation, he broke free from the crowd and sprinted toward the burning house. "Hey you!" "Stop!" one of the firefighters shouted after him, but Brian was already beyond the reach of reason, driven by a primal determination that overpowered any fear. Inside the blazing house, the heat was unbearable, wrapping around Brian like a suffocating blanket. The flames swirled in a gruesome dance, devouring everything in their path. Brian pulled his shirt over his nose and mouth, trying to shield himself from the toxic smoke as he ascended the stairs. Each step groaned ominously under his weight, threatening to give way at any moment. On the second floor, the hallway was thick with smoke, but he could hear a faint, desperate cry coming from one of the rooms. "I'm here to save you," he called out, his voice muffled and strained. He pushed through the smoke, finding the terrified child curled up under the bed. Gently but urgently, Brian scooped her into his arms, feeling her tiny body shiver with fear. "It's going to be all right," he assured her, his own heart pounding with anxiety. The journey back was agonizing. The fire had spread, and a heavy beam crashed down from the ceiling, blocking their path with a deafening roar. Brian kicked at the burning wood, creating a narrow passage. Every step was a battle against the encroaching flames and the ticking clock. Finally, they burst out of the front door and into the open air. The crowd outside erupted in cheers and tears, their relief palpable. For Brian, the ordeal was far from over. The smoke had taken its toll, and his body, covered in burns and exhausted beyond measure, began to betray him. His legs buckled, and he collapsed on the sidewalk, still clutching the child tightly. As the world around him blurred and darkened, he could hear the distant wail of sirens and the frantic shouts of the crowd. His last coherent thought, drifting through the haze of exhaustion, was a simple one: "I did what I could." Brian didn't witness the anxious faces of the firefighters and paramedics rushing to his aid. He had already succumbed to unconsciousness, his heroic deed complete, yet his fate hanging precariously in the balance. The impenetrable darkness surrounding Brian began to lift, replaced by a blinding light and a cacophony of indistinct sounds piercing the silence. He blinked against the harsh glare, struggling to comprehend his surroundings. His entire body ached profoundly. His skin felt searing hot, as if it still smoldered from the flames, and each breath was a torment. Slowly, the blurred outline of a woman in a white coat sharpened into focus before him. It was the attending doctor, her expression a mixture of concern and relief as she monitored his vital signs. "Brian, you're in the hospital." "My name is Dr. Lords, and I'm here to take care of you," she explained gently, recognizing the confusion in his eyes. "You inhaled a significant amount of smoke and suffered multiple burns, but you are safe now." Brian's mind immediately fixated on the child. "Where's the girl?" he managed to croak, his voice raspy and frail. The simple act of speaking seemed to sap the remaining energy from his battered body. "Doctor." Lord smiled softly, her eyes reflecting a weary relief. "She's safe, thanks to you. She's with her family now, and they're all immensely grateful." A wave of relief washed over Brian, mingling with the intense pain that enveloped him. Despite his weakened state, a sense of peace settled in his heart. He had saved her. The effort, the agony, the danger, all of it had been worth it. As he drifted back into unconsciousness, he carried with him the knowledge that his actions had made a profound difference. Those words brought momentary comfort to Brian, but the sharp pain throbbing in his chest and limbs quickly overshadowed it. He tried to move, but Dr. Lords gently shook her head, careful not to touch his fragile skin. "Don't try to move. You're still very weak. We need to keep you hospitalized for a while longer to monitor your recovery." The following days in the hospital were a haze of feverish dreams and fleeting moments of clarity. Brian was tormented by visions of the raging fire and the anguish he had witnessed. During his brief moments of lucidity, he overheard Dr. Lords and other doctors discussing his condition, the looming risk of infection, and the necessity for additional surgeries. One day, Dr. Lords approached him with a grave expression. "Brian, you're doing well considering the circumstances, but you're not out of danger yet. We need to perform more procedures to properly treat your burns," she said, her tone serious. Brian nodded slowly, the reality of his situation beginning to sink in. "Do whatever is necessary," he murmured, a spark of determination flickering within him despite his weakened state. Night after night, Brian was plagued by nightmares, frequently waking in a panic, his body drenched in sweat as the machines around him beeped frantically. During one particularly harrowing episode, his longtime friend Robert visited, bringing a semblance of normalcy to his chaotic world. "How are you holding up, buddy?" Robert asked, trying to sound upbeat, but his eyes betrayed his deep concern. Brian managed a weak smile, trying to ease his friend's worry. "Like I fought a dragon and lost," he replied, attempting to lighten the mood with a touch of humor. Robert chuckled softly, pulling up a chair beside Brian's bed. "Well, you're one tough guy, Brian. If anyone can bounce back from this, it's you." The presence of his friend brought a small measure of comfort to Brian. The days stretched on, marked by a grueling cycle of treatments and recovery, but the support of friends like Robert and the unwavering care of Dr. Lords gave him the strength to keep fighting. Despite the pain and the uncertainty, Brian held onto the hope that he would eventually overcome this ordeal, just as he had faced and conquered challenges before. Robert laughed, but his expression quickly turned serious. "You did something incredible, Brian. Everyone is talking about how you saved that little girl. You're a hero." Those words were intended to comfort, but for Brian, they felt like a heavy reminder of the terrifying moment that little girl had endured. He glanced at the bandages encasing his body, the pain and discomfort a constant testament to his sacrifice. "I just did what had to be done, Robert. I don't feel like a hero," he said quietly. The days in the hospital stretched into weeks, and Brian began to make slow but significant progress in his recovery. Each small movement was a triumph, each less painful breath of victory. Dr. Lords was frequently by his side, offering not only medical care but also words of encouragement. "You're getting better, Brian. Your body is healing, and your strength is returning. You'll have some scars, but you'll be alive. And that's what matters most," she assured him, her presence a beacon of hope. Brian clung to life, driven by the promise he made to himself to keep fighting, not just for his recovery, but also to ensure that no one else would suffer as he had if he could prevent it. As he slowly regained his strength, his awareness of the world outside his hospital room began to sharpen. During visits from doctors and nurses, snippets of conversations about fires in the poorer areas of the city reached his ears, igniting a growing unease within him. He learned of the struggles faced by those living in the most vulnerable neighborhoods, where fires were a frequent and devastating occurrence. The realization that many lived in constant fear of such tragedies stirred something deep within him. He resolved to do more, to use his experience and newfound purpose to make a difference. Brian's recovery was marked by determination and resilience. The pain was excruciating, but each day brought small victories. His muscles grew stronger, and he began to take tentative steps, encouraged by the unwavering support of Dr. Lords and his friend Robert. Their belief in him bolstered his spirits, and he found solace in their presence. One day, as Brian practiced walking down the hospital corridor with Robert by his side, he stopped and turned to his friend. "Robert, I've been thinking. I can't just go back to my old life after this. I want to help those who are at risk, those who might face what I did but without the same outcome." Robert nodded, a proud smile spreading across his face. "I knew you'd come out of this stronger. Whatever you decide, I'm with you." With renewed purpose, Brian continued his rehabilitation, determined to heal not just his body but also to transform his ordeal into a force for good. As the weeks passed, he began to see a future beyond the hospital walls, a future where he could make a real impact and help prevent others from enduring the same pain and fear. One day, while Dr. Lords was adjusting his IV, Brian seized the opportunity to ask, "Have the fires been frequent?" Dr. Lords looked around before responding, lowering her voice. "Yes, and many of us are worried. It's not normal and always in the same places." Brian frowned, pain and fatigue momentarily forgotten. "Do you think it's intentional?" he asked, suspicion dawning in his mind. Dr. Lord sighed. "I don't know, Brian, but I hope someone finds out soon. The officials are still analyzing the evidence." With his mind racing about the fires, Brian spent his waking hours gathering more information from people passing through the corridors. Each new detail he learned only increased his determination to uncover the truth as soon as he could leave the hospital. He wondered, why always the poor areas? What could be gained from this? Each visit from Robert became an opportunity to discuss his theories and plans. "Robert, you need to help me investigate this when I get out of here," Brian insisted during one of these visits, his tone firmer than his condition suggested. "Of course, Brian, of course. But first, you need to get well," Robert replied, worried about his friend's health, but also motivated by the quest for justice. As the days went by, Brian's resolve grew stronger. The conversations with Robert became more detailed and focused. They discussed possible motives, potential suspects, and ways to gather evidence. Brian's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts and strategies, each one aimed at uncovering the truth behind the fires. During one particularly intense discussion, Brian said, "Robert, I can't just sit here and recover. People are suffering, and if someone is doing this on purpose, they need to be stopped." Robert nodded, understanding the depth of Brian's commitment. "I get it, Brian. We'll find a way to help, but you need your strength. This fight will require all of it." Brian's determination was unwavering. "I know, Robert, and I'll get there, but we need to be ready. The moment I'm out of here, we start." The weeks continued to pass, each day bringing Brian closer to recovery. His physical strength slowly returned, But it was his mental resilience that shone the brightest. The pain and trauma of the fire had transformed into a burning desire for justice. "Doctor," Lords noticed this change and approached Brian one day. "You're looking better, Brian. But I can see something else driving you. What's on your mind?" Brian met her gaze with a look of fierce determination. "I can't let this go, Dr. Lords. Those fires, there's something behind them, and I need to find out what. People are in danger." "Doctor." Lords nodded, a mixture of concern and admiration in her eyes. "Just promise me you'll take care of yourself, too. We need more people like you, not fewer." Brian smiled, a hint of the old spark returning. "I promise. But first, we need to stop whoever is causing this." As Brian's discharge day approached, the hospital room buzzed with a mix of anticipation and tension. Brian felt a renewed sense of purpose, a mission that extended beyond his recovery. He had faced the flames and come out the other side, and now he was ready to face whatever darkness lay behind the fires plaguing his city. When the day finally came, Brian stood at the hospital entrance, Robert by his side. The air felt fresh, the world alive with possibilities. He took a deep breath, feeling the strength in his legs and the fire in his heart. "Let's do this," Robert Brian said, his voice steady and resolute. Robert clapped him on the shoulder. "Together, my friend. Let's uncover the truth and bring justice to those who need it most." With that, they stepped into the sunlight, ready to take on whatever challenges lay ahead, driven by the knowledge that their fight was just beginning. Robert began asking his questions, talking to residents of the affected areas, and sharing his findings with Brian. "There are patterns, Brian. The fires seem to only happen in the poorer regions, as if they want to clear these areas," he reported, increasing the unease of both. As the days passed, Brian's health improved, allowing him to sit up in bed for longer periods. "Doctor," Lords, observing his progress, began talking about his imminent discharge. "You've been recovering well, Brian. Soon you'll be able to continue this mission of yours at home," she said, half joking. Brian, however, took this very seriously. "As soon as I get out of here, I'm going straight there. I need to see with my own eyes what's happening," he said, hoping the child he saved was in a safe place. One morning, as Brian watched the sunrise through the hospital window, feeling the soft light on his face, he reflected on his journey. "I survived for a reason," he murmured more to himself than anyone else in the room. "And I won't rest until I know these fires stop for good." Thus, with renewed determination and a clear purpose, Brian continued his path to recovery, each step bringing him closer to discovering the truth behind the fires. Finally, the day came when Brian was discharged. Standing outside the hospital, he took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his responsibility pressing down on him. "It's time," he said to Robert, who stood beside him, ready to help. Robert nodded. "Let's go. We have a lot of work ahead of us." They started by visiting the neighborhoods affected by the fires, talking to residents, and gathering more information. The stories were eerily similar: fires breaking out in the dead of night, quickly engulfing homes and leaving families homeless. The pattern was too consistent to be a coincidence. Brian's blood boiled. "I will go to the end to prove the truth and help everyone," he vowed, undaunted by the powerful man before him. Leaving the building, Brian felt the weight of the encounter as he reached the sidewalk. He noticed he was not alone. Two men, who seemed to have come straight from a corporate security team, started following him. "It would be better for everyone if you let this go," one of them said, approaching closer than was comfortable. "We're not asking, we're warning." With a racing heart, but a clear mind about what needed to be done, Brian quickly walked away. He knew he needed to make his discovery public before it was too late. "George will know what to do with this," he murmured to himself, grabbing his phone to arrange an urgent meeting. The gravity of the situation sank in as Brian met with George, an investigative journalist known for exposing corruption. "We need to get this out there," Brian said, urgency lacing his voice. "People need to know what's happening." George listened intently, his expression grave. "We'll get to the bottom of this, Brian. But you need to be careful. Whoever is behind these fires won't stop at anything." Brian nodded, understanding the danger but resolute in his mission. "I won't back down, George. Too many lives are at stake." As they parted ways, Brian felt a renewed sense of purpose. The path ahead was fraught with danger, but his resolve was unwavering. He had survived the flames, and now he would fight the shadowy forces threatening his community. With Robert and George by his side, he knew they had a chance to uncover the truth and bring justice to those who had suffered. Brian's journey had transformed him from a mechanic into a reluctant hero, driven by a fierce determination to protect his community. As he walked away from the meeting, his steps were sure, his mind focused. The fight was far from over, but Brian was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, fueled by the belief that justice would prevail. As Brian walked briskly through the busy city streets, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The decision was made he would not retreat, no matter the cost. This was about justice, and he was prepared to see it through to the end. Despite George's phone being unreachable, Brian sent him every piece of evidence he had collected: photographs, detailed notes about the fires, and the harrowing recording of the threats made against him. With his information sent, Brian proceeded to the newspaper office, located in the city's upscale district. Navigating the bustling streets towards the newspaper's headquarters, Brian's pace quickened. His urgency was palpable, each step driven by the critical nature of his mission. The city, with its towering skyscrapers and convoluted streets, seemed almost oppressive. Every street corner felt like a reminder of the powerful forces attempting to silence him. Just a few blocks from his destination, the acrid smell of smoke intensified a scent that immediately sent a jolt of dread through him. Initially, he doubted his senses, wondering if the lingering trauma from the previous fire was playing tricks on him. However, as he rounded a corner, his fears were confirmed. A dark column of smoke was billowing against the afternoon sky. Without a second thought, Brian altered his course and sprinted towards the source of the smoke, his instincts guiding him. The scene was a chaotic mess of flashing emergency lights and blaring sirens. Brian pushed through the crowd, his heart racing as he reached the affluent neighborhood where a grand mansion was engulfed in a fierce blaze. Flames roared with an almost malicious intensity, consuming the lavish structure with unrelenting hunger. Spectators gathered around, their phones capturing every moment of the disaster. Brian's attention was quickly drawn to a desperate cry for help. Among the onlookers, a group of people frantically pointed towards the upper floors of the mansion. From a smoke-filled window, a figure was visible, waving frantically for assistance. The sight of someone trapped in such dire straits ignited a familiar sense of urgency in Brian. Ignoring the chaos around him, Brian darted towards the mansion. His eyes locked onto the window where the trapped individual was making frantic gestures. He knew he had to act swiftly. The structure was already groaning under the strain of the fire, and every second counted. His previous ordeal had taught him how crucial it was to act quickly in such situations. Navigating through the crowd, Brian found a fireman and shouted above the din, "There's someone trapped up there. We need to get them out now." The firefighter, initially stunned by Brian's sudden appearance, quickly assessed the situation. With a nod of determination, he relayed the information to his team. Brian watched as a rescue operation was hastily organized, the firemen preparing their gear and positioning ladders. As the firefighters scaled the ladder, Brian's anxiety grew. He kept his eyes fixed on the window, hoping against hope that they would reach the trapped person in time. The situation was dire, and the urgency was almost palpable. Brian's heart pounded, not just from the adrenaline but from the memories of his recent rescue. Minutes felt like hours, but finally the firefighters managed to reach the window and pull the trapped individual to safety. The crowd erupted into cheers and sighs of relief as the person, an elderly woman, pale and shaken but alive, was brought down the ladder to solid ground. Brian exhaled deeply, the weight of the moment pressing heavily on him. The fire was still raging, but for now a life had been saved. He stood amidst the chaotic scene, feeling a mixture of exhaustion and triumph. His mission was far from over, but he had made a difference today. As the emergency crews continued their work and the crowd began to disperse, Brian knew he couldn't stay. He needed to get to the newspaper office and ensure George received the critical information about the fires. He pushed through the remaining crowd and headed back toward his original destination, his resolve stronger than ever. The fight for justice was far from over, but Brian was ready to face whatever came next. Without a moment's hesitation, Brian threw himself into action, driven by a deep-seated instinct and a haunting familiarity with the chaos of fires. The sight of the flames consuming the grand mansion stirred memories of his recent ordeal, fueling his resolve to help. "Someone, call for additional help," he yelled at a bystander who was already engaged with emergency services. Brian's eyes darted around the scene, searching for anything that could aid in his mission. Every heartbeat seemed to echo the urgency of the situation. Grabbing a nearby garden hose, he began to direct a stream of water at the base of the raging flames, hoping to carve out a temporary safe zone for the approaching firefighters. Amidst the cacophony of the blaze and the panicked voices of the crowd, a piercing scream cut through the din, its raw desperation sharper than any siren's wail. The sound seemed to freeze time, making Brian's heart race with a chilling premonition. This was no ordinary cry, it was a beacon, guiding him to where he was most needed. Ignoring the searing heat and the smoke that clawed at his lungs, Brian's resolve hardened. He had to act. The scream was not just a call for help, it was a rallying cry that would drive him to face the inferno. With every step he took toward the burning mansion, the heat intensified, making the air shimmer like a distorted mirage. The blaze consumed the opulent structure with an insatiable hunger, shattering windows and scattering glass shards that glistened like fallen stars on the asphalt below. Brian's determination was unwavering as he focused on the less engulfed side of the mansion. There, he spotted a service door, a potential entry point into the inferno. The air around the door was stifling, nearly unbearable. Brian took a deep breath, covering his face with his shirt sleeve to shield himself from the scorching heat. He delivered a series of powerful kicks to the door, his efforts driven by the urgency of the situation. With a final, forceful blow, the wood splintered and gave way, allowing him access to the blazing interior. Stepping into the inferno, Brian felt the heat envelop him like a wall of searing fire. The room was a tempest of flames and smoke, the air thick and choking. He could barely see through the haze, but he forced himself to push forward. The desperate cries grew louder, guiding him through the smoke-filled corridors. He navigated the treacherous terrain, each step a battle against the encroaching flames and the suffocating heat. Brian's senses were overwhelmed by the intensity of the fire, but he remained focused. He moved with purpose, driven by the knowledge that every second counted. The scream had become his compass, leading him through the inferno. As he advanced deeper into the mansion, his mind raced with thoughts of the person he needed to save. The urgency of the situation was etched into every fiber of his being, and he was determined not to let this chance slip away. Amid the blaze, Brian's bravery was tested like never before. He pushed through the searing heat and choking smoke, his resolve unwavering. With each step, he drew closer to the source of the desperate cries, driven by an unyielding sense of duty and the hope that he could make a difference. Brian's movements were swift and determined as he navigated through the maze of flames and smoke. The heat was unbearable, and the acrid smell of burning materials filled his nostrils, but he kept his focus. He crouched low to avoid the thick smoke that billowed from above, his shirt wrapped around his face to filter out the choking fumes. When he finally found Julie, her fear-stricken eyes met his through the haze. The room was engulfed in flames, with no visible escape routes. Brian's heart pounded as he grabbed her hand, pulling her toward what he hoped would be a safe path. They retraced Brian's steps, but the fire had spread too quickly, sealing off their original escape routes. Every choice seemed fraught with danger as the fire raged around them. As they made their way back down the staircase, a burning beam crashed down near them, striking Brian's arm with a searing pain. He gritted his teeth, the adrenaline surging through him, dulling the intensity of the injury. The beam partially blocked their path, sending sparks flying in all directions. Brian quickly assessed the situation, pushing past the pain to protect Julie. "We have to go over it," he said, his voice strained but determined. He helped Julie climb over the burning debris, his own legs exposed to the blistering heat. The flames scorched through his clothes, and the pain became almost unbearable. But Brian forced himself to stay focused, driven by the urgent need to get Julie to safety. "My name is Brian. What's yours?" he asked through gritted teeth, his focus on the task at hand. "Julie," she replied, her voice trembling with fear and exhaustion. "I promise, Julie." "I'll get you out of here," Brian said, his voice filled with resolve. Despite the pain and the perilous conditions, he was unwavering in his commitment. Each step was a struggle, but his determination to save Julie kept him moving. As they neared the front of the mansion, the flames intensified, and the heat became almost unbearable. Brian could feel the toll the fire was taking on him, but he pushed through, his focus solely on getting Julie to safety. The roar of the fire and the crackling of burning wood created a chaotic symphony that threatened to overwhelm him, but he remained steadfast. Finally, as they reached the front of the mansion, Brian spotted the faint outlines of firefighters and emergency personnel working to control the blaze. With one last burst of energy, he guided Julie toward the firefighters, collapsing onto the ground as he handed her over. The firefighters rushed to assist, quickly taking Julie to safety, while others began to tend to Brian's injuries. Exhausted and barely conscious, Brian's vision blurred as the scene around him became a whirlwind of activity. He heard Julie's heartfelt thanks and the distant voices of the emergency responders, but the overwhelming fatigue and pain began to take their toll. As he was carried away, Brian's last thoughts were of Julie's safety and the hope that he had made a difference, despite the cost. Brian's world had become a chaotic blur of flames, smoke, and pain. The roar of the fire was a constant, oppressive presence, and the heat was nearly unbearable. Every breath was a struggle, each inhalation filled with the acrid scent of burning debris. The fire's ferocity was consuming everything in its path, and Brian was barely able to stay upright. As he watched Julie disappear through the smoke and flames, Brian's heart swelled with a mix of relief and pain. He managed a weak smile, his eyes meeting hers one last time as she ran to safety. The sight of her escape, coupled with the growing intensity of the fire, allowed him a fleeting moment of peace before the reality of his situation closed in. Brian fell to his knees, the exhaustion and agony finally overwhelming him. He could feel the heat searing his skin, the burns on his back and arms screaming with every movement. Despite the pain, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment. He had fulfilled his promise to Julie and had given her the chance to live when it seemed so precarious. That thought was a small solace amid the growing darkness. The fire continued its relentless assault, the flames dancing ever closer, blocking any potential escape routes. Brian could hear the distant wail of sirens, growing louder as the emergency services arrived, but his strength was fading quickly. The smoke was thick and suffocating, and the heat was unbearable. The fire seemed to mock his efforts, consuming everything in its path with a ferocious appetite. Outside, Julie was surrounded by emergency responders. Her face was streaked with soot, her eyes wide with terror and desperation. She watched helplessly as the firefighters charged towards the inferno, her voice hoarse from screaming for help. The flashing lights of the emergency vehicles reflected off her tear-streaked face, and she felt a growing sense of despair as the fire's roar intensified. "Please," Julie cried out, her voice breaking. "He's still inside. He needs help." The firefighters, now fully mobilized, pushed through the growing chaos, their faces set in grim determination. They entered the burning mansion with the courage and resolve of professionals who had faced countless dangers. Every second felt like an eternity to Julie as she waited, her heart pounding with a mix of hope and dread. Inside the house, Brian's situation grew more critical. The fire was consuming the space around him, and the unbearable heat forced him to the ground. He could feel his strength waning, each breath a laborious effort. Yet even as his consciousness began to fade, he clung to the thought that he had made a difference. The pain and the fire were overwhelming, but the knowledge that he had saved a life gave him a measure of comfort. As the firefighters navigated through the smoke and flames, they finally reached Brian. Their faces were masked with determination and concern, and their swift actions reflected their dedication to saving lives. They carefully lifted Brian, their hands skilled and gentle despite the urgency of the situation. As they carried him to safety, the chaos of the fire continued to rage behind them, a testament to the fierce battle they had fought to rescue him. Outside, Julie watched with bated breath as Brian was carried from the building. Her emotions were a tangled mess of relief, gratitude, and heartache. She saw Brian, battered and burned but alive, and a wave of tears washed over her. The realization of his bravery and sacrifice struck her deeply, leaving her with a profound sense of respect and admiration. The scene was a mix of flashing lights, urgent activity, and the echoes of the fire's roar. Brian was rushed to a waiting ambulance, where medical personnel worked swiftly to stabilize him. Julie's heart ached as she watched him being taken away, but she found solace in the knowledge that he had survived. As the fire was eventually brought under control and the mansion reduced to smoldering ruins, the city was left to grapple with the aftermath. The bravery of one man had saved a life, and in doing so, had brought to light the sacrifices and heroism that often went unseen. Brian's actions would be remembered not just for the lives saved, but for the indomitable spirit he had displayed in the face of overwhelming adversity. Felt the weight of Brian's sacrifice deeply. The phone call from the hospital had been a somber wake-up call, a stark reminder of the perilous path Brian had walked and the heroism that had led him to his final moments. George knew he had to honor Brian's legacy by continuing the fight against the corruption and injustice that had pushed Brian into harm's way. The city was in mourning. People who had never met Brian came together to remember him, inspired by the selflessness and bravery he had displayed. Vigils were held, and tributes poured in from every corner of the community. The media coverage was extensive, but it was clear that the most profound tribute came from the lives he had touched directly. Julie, forever changed by Brian's sacrifice, found herself at the center of the public's attention. She struggled to process the enormity of what had happened, grappling with the trauma and the overwhelming sense of responsibility that came with surviving such an ordeal. She spoke out about Brian's bravery, emphasizing the depth of his commitment and the impact he had made. Her words were raw and heartfelt, resonating with people who had followed the news. Brian's family and friends were left to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives, grappling with grief and the unanswered questions that lingered in the wake of his death. Robert, who had promised Brian to help uncover the truth, worked tirelessly to fulfill that vow. He continued to investigate the suspicious fires, now driven not only by the need for justice but also by the memory of his friend's ultimate sacrifice. The investigation into the fires began to gain traction, spurred on by the heightened public interest and media coverage. Evidence slowly began to surface, connecting the dots between the arson attacks and a network of powerful individuals with vested interests in clearing out the poorer areas of the city. The case grew more complex, involving layers of corruption and deceit, but Robert, alongside other dedicated individuals, pushed forward with relentless determination. In the end, Brian's legacy became a symbol of hope and justice. His sacrifice sparked a wave of change, leading to reforms and increased scrutiny of the systemic issues that had contributed to the tragedy. The fires were eventually addressed, and the corruption behind them was exposed, thanks in part to the courageous stand taken by Brian. The story of Brian's heroism lived on, a powerful reminder of the difference one person could make. His final act of bravery not only saved a life but had ignited a movement for change, proving that even in the darkest moments, the light of human compassion and courage could shine through. As we come to the end of Brian's powerful story, it's clear that his sacrifice and bravery have left an indelible mark on all of us. From the courage he showed in the face of unimaginable danger to the changes his actions inspired, Brian's journey teaches us the profound impact of selflessness and standing up for what is right. What have you learned from Brian's story? How has it inspired you to make a difference in your own life? Share one lesson or insight you've gained and how you plan to apply it in the comments below. If you liked this video, please leave your comment. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel for more inspiring content. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.